A wealthy man impregnated a homeless woman, and everyone laughed at his expense, but 5 years later they all regretted it. David Carvalho, a man with a perpetually cold and detached gaze, drove his luxury car through the city streets. His life revolved around endless meetings, lavish dinners, and lucrative contracts. He possessed everything one could wish for: grand estates, sports cars, and trips to exotic locations. However, despite his name being synonymous with achievement, he felt an emptiness that wealth couldn't fill. That night, like many before, he found himself alone behind the wheel, his mind flooded with troubling thoughts. The quiet of the luxury vehicle contrasted sharply with the vibrant noise of the bustling streets outside. He stared blankly out the windows until something caught his eye at the intersection of a busy avenue. Beneath an awning, a young woman huddled, clutching a tattered blanket for warmth, her disheveled hair draping over her shoulders. What captivated him was her gaze, hollow yet brimming with an unexplainable strength. David halted at the red light, studying her for a few seconds. Who was she? How could someone so young be in this situation? The car behind him honked, snapping him back to reality. He pressed the gas, but the image of the woman lingered in his mind. In the following days, that figure remained a persistent shadow, a constant reminder of the lack of purpose in his life. Without fully understanding why, David resolved to drive that way again a few days later. She was there, in the same spot, as if time had stood still for her. This time, he didn't just look. He parked a few meters away and walked toward her. The woman noticed his approach, but showed no reaction, remaining curled up and watching him warily in silence. "Are you hungry?" David asked straightforwardly, unsure of how to proceed. She met his gaze, her eyes narrow from having seen too much in life yet still holding on to some hope. "I don't need charity," she replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. David crouched down to meet her at eye level. "It's not charity, it's just food." She hesitated, but her stomach growled loudly enough for both to hear. Without saying another word, he handed her a bag with bread and fruit he had picked up from a nearby bakery. She accepted the bag without a word of thanks, yet he noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she opened it and began to eat. David recognized her hunger, but she still consumed the food slowly, as if to savor the moment, her eyes ever watchful, lacking complete trust in him. "My name is David," he said, trying to break the silence. She looked at him briefly, as if weighing whether to respond. "Clara," she replied tersely before returning to her meal. "How long have you been here?" David inquired, but Clara didn't answer right away. She finished chewing a piece of bread. As she finished eating, Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand before speaking. "Too long," she said. David looked around, observing the indifference of passers-by who hurried by without noticing Clara, as if she were part of the urban landscape. "You have nowhere to go," he insisted. "No," Clara replied definitively. There were no more details to share. The conversation had already ventured too far. David realized he wouldn't get any further answers that night. He straightened his coat and took a step back. "I'll return tomorrow if you need anything else," he said, looking directly at her, but Clara averted her gaze, as if she had already disconnected from their brief exchange. As David walked away, he felt a pang of discomfort, as if he were leaving something important behind. Even when he returned to the comfort of his home, Clara's image lingered in his mind. The next day, David went through his routine, meetings with influential businessmen, discussions about new investments, and lavish dinners with people he barely knew. Yet, everything felt like a distant echo, something he did automatically without emotional engagement. Amid all this, Clara's image never left him. No matter how hard he focused on work, there was something about her that captivated him. "You're more distracted than usual today," commented his partner Gustavo during a business dinner. "Just thinking about some things," David replied, not wanting to continue the conversation. "It's someone, isn't it?" Gustavo teased, laughing. "Don't tell me someone finally touched the heart of stone of David Carvalho." David simply smiled faintly, trying to end the topic, But the truth was he didn't even know exactly what he felt. That night, David chose to return to the spot where he had found Clara. He felt curious, but there was something deeper driving him. Upon arrival, he saw her again under the awning, in the same spot, with the same weary expression. This time, he brought more than just food. He had clothes, blankets, and even some money. As he approached, he noticed Clara recognized him immediately, though her face revealed nothing but mild surprise. "Here are some clothes and blankets for you," he said, hoping for a different reaction than the previous night. Clara glanced at the items for a moment and, without a word, took what he offered. There was no gratitude, but he didn't expect any. He understood that for someone in her position, trust was a rare commodity. "You shouldn't do this," Clara murmured, still examining the clothes he had just handed her. "Do what?" David asked, puzzled. "Think you can change someone's life with a little charity?" Clara said, looking at him with a mix of anger and sadness. David didn't respond right away. He knew she was right, but something inside him prevented him from giving up. He wasn't there just out of altruism. There was something more he couldn't identify. In the following days, David found himself unable to resist returning to that same place. David continued to seek more about Clara, who remained reluctant to accept any help he offered. Yet he could see the exhaustion in her eyes each time they met. Still, Clara was a woman of few words, always keeping a barrier between herself and David, as if refusing to let him into any part of her story. "You keep coming back," Clara remarked one night, her tone blending curiosity with irritation. "Maybe because I believe you deserve more than this," David replied, gesturing to the streets around them. She let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Everyone thinks they know what's best for others. Do you think you have the answers to my life?" David looked at her thoughtfully. "I don't think I have all the answers, but I believe I can help." Clara turned away, fiddling with her blanket disdainfully. "People like you don't understand. You offer me a few things and then return to your perfect life while I stay here, and nothing changes." Her words struck David hard. He knew there was truth in what she said, yet he didn't feel deterred. There was something about her that challenged him to keep coming back. He wanted to do more than just provide temporary help. He wanted to understand Clara, and that thought unsettled him. One cloudy afternoon, as Clara watched the passers-by, an older woman hurried past, casting a disapproving glance. "These people on the street have no shame," the woman muttered, adjusting her designer handbag, oblivious to David's presence. Feeling a wave of frustration, David stepped closer to the woman. "What did you say?" He confronted her firmly. "I didn't mean to offend," she stammered, recoiling. "But you must understand, those people live on handouts. Who can respect someone like that?" Clara glanced sideways, visibly uncomfortable but unsurprised, as if accustomed to such comments. However, David felt anger rising in his chest. Respect isn't something earned through clothes or status. "Maybe you should think a bit more before you speak," he said coldly, silencing the woman. She looked at him in shock and quickly walked away, murmuring something inaudible. After she vanished into the crowd, Clara turned to David, her eyes a mix of surprise and something deeper. "You didn't have to do that," she said, breaking the silence. "I know," David replied, shaking his head. "But I wanted to." Clara didn't say anything more, yet something shifted in that moment. The barrier that once felt impenetrable began to dissolve slowly. In the following days, Clara allowed David to sit beside her more often, and they began to talk. Initially, their conversations were superficial, but gradually they deepened. David discovered that Clara was far more than just a homeless woman. She was someone who had faced unimaginable hardships, yet somehow managed to stay standing, even if she felt broken inside. "How did you end up here?" David asked one night as he gazed at the twinkling city lights in the distance. Clara hesitated, glancing at the grimy ground beneath her feet. "It's a long story." "I have time," he insisted, his voice gentle yet filled with curiosity. She let out a heavy sigh, as if tired of carrying the burden of her past. I used to have a normal life, you know. College, a bright future, like everyone says. But one thing led to another, and I lost it all. David looked at her, wanting to know more, yet sensing that Clara wasn't ready to fully open up. Do you think you can rebuild your life? He asked. She met his gaze with a vacant look. I think I've passed the point of rebuilding anything. David wouldn't accept that answer. To him, there was something more within her, a hidden strength that Clara couldn't see herself. He didn't quite know what motivated him, but he was determined to show her that life still had something to offer. What if you're wrong? He said with a soft smile. What if I can help you prove that? Clara shook her head, laughing without humor. You and your hero ideas. Things aren't that simple. However, even if Clara didn't acknowledge it, David's constant presence began to bring subtle changes to her life. It wasn't just his food or the clothes he offered. It was the fact that someone returned day after day, genuinely caring for her while the rest of the world ignored her. David didn't know how, but that bond was strengthening. He had never met anyone like Clara, and for the first time in a long while, he felt his own life shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. He glanced back at Clara, who was now distracted by the streetlights. You still haven't shared your whole story with me, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. She looked at him, her eyes sorrowful yet somehow lighter than before. Maybe one day I will. That night, David found it hard to sleep. His brief conversation with Clara echoed in his mind. He sensed that there was more behind her words, something dark and heavy that held her back from moving forward. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't imagine what could have led her to the streets. His curiosity grew each day, along with his desire to help. He was convinced that Clara deserved more than the life she was living and that he could be the key to her transformation. The following afternoon, David took his usual route, eager to see her. But when he arrived at the spot where Clara usually stayed, something felt off. The area was empty and her worn blanket was nowhere in sight. Clara had vanished. He scanned the surroundings for any sign of her, but found nothing. A sense of panic began to creep in. Excuse me, David said, stopping a hurried man passing by. Have you seen a woman who usually stayed here wrapped in a blanket? The man barely glanced at him and grumbled, Every day a new one shows up. I don't know. And who are you talking about? David sighed, feeling frustration rise within him. He spent the next few hours wandering the area, asking anyone he could if they remembered her, but no one seemed to have paid enough attention to Clara's invisibility in the world around her. It was suffocating. She could simply vanish and no one would notice. Did you see her? He asked a street vendor who regarded him with curiosity. I haven't seen that girl in a few days. I think she disappeared. But that's how it goes with homeless people, right? One day they're here, the next... I don't know, the vendor replied, while arranging his goods. David said nothing and walked on, battling the feeling that he was losing Clara forever. He needed to find her, to know if she was okay. He continued strolling through the streets, stopping at shelters and asking those living on the streets, but no one had any concrete information. Just as he was about to give up, he noticed a group of people gathered around a square. An ambulance was parked nearby and he rushed over, fearing the worst. As he drew closer, his heart sank at the sight of Clara lying on the ground, pale and shaking with fever. She was surrounded by paramedics, her appearance hauntingly fragile. What happened to her? David asked breathlessly, addressing the paramedics. Dehydration and probably some serious infection. She needs urgent medical care, one of the responders replied as they loaded Clara onto a stretcher. Without hesitation, David took out his phone and called the nearest hospital, ensuring Clara would receive the best possible treatment. The paramedics regarded him warily, accustomed to seeing people like him stand back and do nothing, but David was not one of those people. Inside the ambulance, beside her, David held her cold hand. Even in her weakened state, Clara tried to speak, her voice faint and drawn out. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked, her breathing labored. He knew exactly how to respond. It was his own motivation. Perhaps it was a sense of justice or guilt for leading such a privileged life. Maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't yet identify. "Because I care," he replied without hesitation, realizing that in that moment, those words were more truthful than he ever imagined. Upon arriving at the hospital, Clara was immediately admitted. David stayed by her side, refusing to leave until he knew she was stable. The doctors informed him that her condition was serious, but with the right treatment, she had a chance to recover. The next morning, as David sat in the waiting room for news, a doctor approached him. "She's out of danger, but we need her to remain under observation for a few days," the doctor said while checking the chart. David breathed a sigh of relief. "I'll stay here as long as necessary," he said resolutely. When Clara awoke, still weak, she saw David by her side. She appeared confused and vulnerable, an expression he had never seen before. For a moment, she said nothing, simply studying him as if trying to comprehend why he was there. Then something shifted in her expression. The wall of distrust she always kept up began to crumble. "I never asked for your help," Clara said, her voice still hoarse but more resolute. "I know," he replied, maintaining his gaze on her eyes. "But that doesn't mean I didn't want to help you." Clara looked away, unable to cope with his honesty. In the days that followed, David kept visiting her at the hospital, and gradually Clara's defenses began to weaken. She still maintained some emotional distance, but it was evident that a transformation was taking place. One afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, Clara turned to him, her face a mixture of fear and relief. "There's something you need to know," she began, hesitating. "I'm pregnant." The words reverberated in the room like a bombshell. David froze, unsure of how to respond. "Pregnant? How did this happen?" He looked at Clara, who now avoided his gaze, clearly embarrassed. "Did you know this?" he asked finally, finding his voice. Clara shook her head. "I found out just before I got sick. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want to add to your burdens." David leaned in closer, gripping Clara's hands firmly. "It's not a burden. It never was. This changes everything. But it doesn't alter how I feel about you." Clara stared at him in surprise, perhaps expecting a different reaction. She was used to rejection, accustomed to seeing people turn their backs on her. But David wasn't like the others. Still, she struggled to understand why he kept returning. "You don't understand, David. My life is chaos, and this baby..." Her voice quivered as if the weight of reality was too much to bear. David gently interrupted her. "This baby will have a chance, and so will you. We'll figure this out together." Clara shut her eyes, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. A part of her still resisted the idea of fully trusting David, but another part, perhaps a deeper one, wanted to believe he truly meant what he said. As David remained by Clara's side, he knew he was embarking on an irreversible path. Nothing would ever be the same. What had started as an attempt to assist a stranger was now evolving into something much deeper and uncontrollable. The news of Clara's pregnancy reached David's inner circle, quickly turning into gossip within the elite social circles, where he had always been a respected and envied presence. The surprise soon morphed into laughter and mockery. After all, how could the relentless businessman David Carvalho, accustomed to mingling with the richest and most powerful, have become involved with a homeless woman and now be expecting a child with her? That weekend, David was invited to a gathering. Before a crucial business event, the kind he would never decline, David's presence felt markedly different this time. All eyes were on him, and whispers were unavoidable amidst the wine glasses and lavish dishes, as discussions about his personal life erupted at every table. Gustavo, his partner, seized the chance to poke fun. So David, I hear you've traded in models and actresses for someone, how should I put it, more unconventional. Gustavo's sly grin elicited stifled laughter from the other business people nearby. David fixed his gaze on his friend, his expression unamused. That's none of your business, Gustavo, and I suggest you concentrate on our work. Come on, lighten up. We're just curious. Nobody expected this from the ever-calculating you, Gustavo retorted, raising his glass and savoring a long sip of wine. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, David distanced himself from the table. He had anticipated this reaction, but hadn't realized how unsettling it would be to confront the jokes from former friends. Discreetly exiting the dining room, he stepped onto the balcony, where the cool night air felt less stifling than the prying gazes. He had barely processed everything concerning Clara and the baby, and now he had to contend with others' judgments. As he gazed at the distant city lights, he heard footsteps behind him. Gustavo, still sporting that mocking grin. "David, are you serious? A homeless woman?" he queried, stopping beside him. "Do you have any idea what this does to your reputation? Your name is splashed across every headline, and it's not for anything good." David sighed, keeping his focus on the city below. "This isn't about reputation, Gustavo. I did what I believed was right." "Right? You're jeopardizing years of work. People won't see you the same way." "You know what that means." Gustavo shot back, visibly annoyed. "It could even be bad for business. Have you thought about that?" David met his gaze with a resolute and icy stare. "If my business relies on me being a monster who doesn't care about anyone, then maybe it's time to reconsider everything." "You don't get it, do you? And I don't expect you to," Gustavo scoffed. Sure, the gentleman on his quest for redemption. Good luck with that. I just hope you have a plan for when everything falls apart." Unfazed, David returned to the main hall where more people awaited him with the same malicious curiosity. He didn't expect their understanding. This was a fight he had to face alone. Despite knowing that, he couldn't shake the weight of isolation. Once respected and feared by his peers, he had now become the butt of jokes. The following morning, headlines were everywhere. Photos of David and Clara splashed across tabloids and gossip sites, with titles like, "The Millionaire Who Lost His Mind," "Who is the Woman Who Changed David Carvalho's Life?" Cruel comments and speculation about the pregnancy flooded social media, with some claiming Clara was merely capitalizing on David's wealth. While others claimed he would lose everything within months, David read some of these articles but refused to let them bother him. His decision was made. During an important meeting later that week, the situation reached an unbearable point. The board of directors of his company, composed of impeccably dressed men and women sitting around a long marble table, openly questioned him. "We are concerned about the recent news regarding your personal life," began one of the directors, peering over his glasses. "This could impact the company's image. Our investors are questioning your decisions, and we need a clear stance." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "My personal life has nothing to do with the business. What I do outside of here doesn't affect my skills as an entrepreneur." Another director intervened, attempting a more conciliatory tone. "We understand, David, but the public does not separate one from the other. They see you and the company as one entity. We need to ensure there are no risks." David shook his head in exasperation. "So you're saying my personal life is a problem for the company? Since when is being human a risk?" The first director replied, unwavering. "It's not about being human, David. It's about control, and it seems you're losing it." David surveyed the table, taking in the serious faces of people he had known for years, those who had once admired him and followed him without question. Now he was viewed as a risk, a threat to what they had built. Rising with the authority that always accompanied him, he stated firmly, "I'm doing what I believe is right. If that's a problem for the company, I'm prepared to face the consequences. But I warn you all, my personal life will not be dictated by advisors or investors." Without waiting for a response, David exited the room. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, but his mind was far from there. He knew this was a battle that had just begun, and the cost of his choices would be steep. Yet, for Clara, and now for the baby, he was willing to confront anything. Upon arriving at the hospital where Clara was still recovering, David entered the room and found her sitting on the bed, gazing out the window. She looked physically better, but the emotional burden remained evident on her face. "How are you?" he asked, approaching her. Clara didn't turn. Her voice was faint. "I think I'm better, but how are things outside?" David sighed and sat beside her. "It's not easy, but I knew it wouldn't be." Clara finally turned to him, sadness in her eyes. "I know they're talking about you because of me. If you want to back out, I would understand." David grasped her hand firmly. "That will never happen. No matter what they say, I'm here, and I always will be." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if processing the weight of his words. She didn't want to be a burden, but she couldn't shake the fear that perhaps she was. At any moment, David could tire of bearing the weight of the situation, yet at that instant, Clara felt for the first time in a long while that she wasn't alone. As the world around them crumbled into jokes, critiques, and judgments, David and Clara were forging something much stronger, something that, despite all adversities, was becoming increasingly unbreakable. Several months passed since David chose to confront the world for Clara. With each new challenge and each fresh critique, he felt more convinced he was on the right path. But the pressure remained unrelenting. His reputation, built over years of relentless business dealings, was now at stake. Nevertheless, nothing made him retreat. Clara, now living with him in his mansion far from prying eyes, was trying to adapt to a life she never dreamed she'd have. However, her pregnancy progressed, bringing complications that the doctors monitored carefully. That day, Clara began experiencing strong contractions earlier than expected. David, who was in his office handling a tense virtual meeting, received a call from a nurse informing him that Clara had been rushed to the hospital. He immediately ended the meeting, grabbed his car keys, and sped to the hospital. Upon arrival, he found Clara in a delivery room surrounded by nurses working frantically. The atmosphere was charged, and he could see the concern etched on the chief doctor's face. "David!" Clara cried, her voice quivering with pain as she reached out to him. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, gripping her hand tightly. "I'm here. I'm with you," he said, trying to mask his own anxiety. His eyes scanned her face, seeking to grasp the seriousness of the situation. The doctor interjected, his tone grave yet professional. "The delivery is more complicated than we anticipated. We're doing everything we can, but the baby is coming early, and that poses risks for both him and Clara." David felt the world freeze for a moment. He looked at Clara, who was struggling to breathe through the contractions, and then back at the doctor. "Do whatever it takes, please save them both." The following hours dragged on like an endless nightmare. David remained by Clara's side, watching as she fought for her life and their child's. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of tension, a faint cry echoed through the room. The baby had been born. A momentary wave of relief washed over David, quickly replaced by worry when he saw that Lucas, their son, was small and fragile. "The baby will need intensive care," the doctor said while nurses hurriedly took Lucas to the neonatal ICU. David watched Clara close her eyes, exhausted. He squeezed her hand gently. "He'll be all right, Clara. Our son will be okay." She opened her eyes with difficulty, a weary smile playing on her lips. "I want to name him Lucas." "Lucas," David repeated, feeling the name fit perfectly. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, grateful for the moment. Or both of them to be alive, but the battle was just beginning. In the following days, Lucas remained in the ICU, surrounded by machines that monitored every heartbeat and breath. David visited the baby daily, dividing his time between Clara, who was still recovering in her room, and the fragile life fighting for survival inside that incubator. However, the headlines remained relentless. Every move of David and Clara was closely followed by the media, which was eager for any sign of failure. Cruel jokes about the baby began circulating, merciless and biting. "The millionaire's child with the beggar" was the kind of headline David saw in newspapers and gossip sites. One afternoon, while David watched Lucas through the glass window of the ICU, Gustavo showed up at the hospital. He didn't seem surprised by what he saw, but his presence was more than a mere courtesy visit. "You know this is still on the table, right?" Gustavo said, folding his arms as he gazed at the baby. "What's on the table?" David asked, not taking his eyes off Lucas. "People are expecting you to give up. They think this is just a phase, that you'll wake up and realize you're ruining your own life," Gustavo said, his voice heavy with judgment. David took a deep breath, already fed up with the insinuations. "And you're here to convince me to give up too?" Gustavo shrugged. "I'm here because we've been friends for a long time, but honestly, I can't understand what's keeping you in this situation." David finally turned to him, his eyes serious and filled with determination. "What keeps me here? My responsibility. My son. If you can't understand that, then there's nothing more to discuss between us." Gustavo shook his head, a cynical smile forming on his lips. "I hope you know what you're doing, David, because honestly it seems like you're swimming against the tide, and everyone is ready to watch the ship sink." David didn't respond. He simply returned to watching Lucas, who was breathing with the aid of machines. The tide was indeed against him, but giving up had never been an option. Not now, with so much at stake. Weeks passed, and Clara was finally discharged. Lucas, however, still needed intensive care. David took Clara home, caring for her with the same attention he devoted to their son. They were far from having a perfect life, but at that moment, they were a family. A small, fragile family. One evening, sitting in the living room, Clara looked at David, her expression serious. "You've never regretted any of this?" David met her gaze, reflecting on everything he had faced up to that point. "Never. I'd do it all again for you and Lucas." Clara looked away, battling tears that threatened to fall. "I just never imagined someone like you would care for someone like me. I don't know if I can repay what you've done for me." David took her hand, squeezing it firmly. "It's not about repayment. We're in this together, and together we will make it." At that moment, something shifted in Clara. For the first time, she began to believe that perhaps the future David envisioned could truly materialize. Even though the entire world seemed against them, Clara felt that with David by her side, they could tackle whatever came their way. Lucas, still small and delicate, would be the reason they fought together. The life that once appeared to Clara as a series of tragedies now offered a glimpse of hope. However, as the world around them continued to doubt, David understood that the real test was yet to come. The future was uncertain, but he was more than ready to confront it with Clara and Lucas beside him. Years passed since Lucas's birth, and David and Clara's lives gradually found a form of balance. They were now residing in a mansion, away from the media spotlight and constant gossip. The world seemed to have grown tired of the tale of the millionaire and the homeless woman, and over time, people began to forget. But within those walls, something remarkable was unfolding, and few could anticipate the twist that awaited them. Lucas, who had been born fragile and premature, was now a lively, healthy boy, full of curiosity. He exhibited an extraordinary intelligence from a very young age. Even before turning 3, he showed an unusual fascination with numbers. The boy would spend hours examining building blocks, arranging them in patterns that made sense only to him. David and Clara noticed this, but didn't think much of it at first. It was natural for parents to find their children exceptional. One evening, while Clara prepared dinner in the kitchen, David sat in the living room with Lucas. The boy was playing on the floor, surrounded by sheets of paper and crayons. David observed him absent-mindedly when Lucas suddenly turned to him and exclaimed, "Daddy, look." David leaned closer, smiling, expecting to see another childlike drawing. Instead, he was surprised to find a series of numbers accompanied by addition and multiplication. "Where did you learn this?" David asked, intrigued. "In my head. I like to play with numbers. They're fun," replied the boy innocently. David frowned, sensing that something was amiss. This wasn't just a typical child's game. He began to closely monitor Lucas's activities, and the more he did, the more impressed he became. The boy was solving complex math problems without any formal education. The following day, David spoke with Clara. "Have you noticed how unique Lucas is?" Clara, busy with some chores, chuckled lightly. "Unique? He's an amazing child, David, but all mothers think that about their kids." David leaned in closer, seriousness in his eyes. "No, Clara, he's not just amazing. Lucas is solving math problems that I can't even comprehend, and he's only 5. Clara paused what she was doing, processing his words. "But how? He hasn't been taught." David nodded. "In his head, I don't know how, but we need to figure out what's happening." In the following weeks, David consulted experts, educators, and even child psychologists, all of whom confirmed his suspicions. Lucas was a prodigy with an exceptionally high IQ. The news began circulating first among David's acquaintances and then on social media. And it wasn't long before television programs expressed interest in interviewing him. One of the first to learn about Lucas's talent was Gustavo, who hadn't seen David in a while. During a dinner with other business people, Gustavo brought up the news with his usual sarcasm. "So it seems the millionaire's son with the homeless woman is a little genius," Gustavo said, laughing, and the others around the table joined in, though their laughter was more restrained this time. Who would have thought something like this could come from that story? David, who had arrived late to the dinner, overheard the comment as he approached. "Yes, Lucas is a genius, and I couldn't be prouder." Silence fell for a moment. David's tone was firm, making it clear he wouldn't tolerate any more jokes about his family. Gustavo, sensing the tension, quickly changed the subject, but the discomfort in the room was palpable. As Lucas's talent gained recognition, prestigious schools began sending offers to enroll him, and invitations for him to participate in international competitions appeared. Child education specialists insisted he had the potential to be one of the great geniuses of his generation. For David, it all felt surreal, but he was determined to ensure Lucas received the best education possible. However, with the recognition came old critics. People who had once laughed at David and Clara's relationship now sought to reconnect. One day, while David and Clara took Lucas to an event for child prodigies, they were approached by a group of David's former acquaintances. "David, what a surprise to see you here," said a man who had previously mocked his relationship with Clara. "And this must be the little genius. Congratulations, he truly has a bright future ahead." David stared at the man for a moment, sensing the insincerity in his words. "Thanks," he replied curtly, "but we don't need your approval." Clara, standing beside him, remained silent, but felt the tension rise. Even though David was protected by his wealth and influence, she still bore the emotional scars from the public scrutiny they faced. No matter how much Lucas's talent was changing the narrative, Clara feared that at some point the old wounds would be reopened. That night, after the event, David sat in the living room watching Lucas play with his numbers and blocks while Clara prepared dinner. He felt a mix of pride and concern, knowing that over time, the pressure on Lucas would intensify, and the expectations surrounding his talent could become overwhelming. Yet above all, he recognized that Clara's past was still a burden she bore, and he worried it might impact their son's future. As Lucas played on the floor, softly murmuring numbers to himself, Clara entered the room and settled beside David. "Do you think we made the right choice?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at her, holding her hand firmly. "I have no doubts. Lucas is meant for something extraordinary, Clara, and we will support him in reaching that." Clara smiled, though concern still lingered in her eyes. The world around them seemed to be changing at last, but she knew that somewhere in the shadows, old critics were waiting for their chance to strike again. Lucas's bright ascent meant they needed to stand united more than ever. His recognition as an international prodigy brought a flood of unwanted attention to the family. Cameras, interviews, and headlines praising the boy's talent while simultaneously bringing up his origins, making the atmosphere increasingly stifling for her. Even with David always by her side, Clara struggled with the burden she carried. The former homeless woman living in a mansion beside one of the wealthiest men in the country still felt exposed and out of place. Each mention of Lucas's rapid rise only fueled more curiosity about her past. Keen journalists sought to dig up information about Clara, hunting for a scandal to exploit. The dread that everything they had built could collapse if her past were misrepresented consumed her. A special event was approaching. Lucas would be honored on an international show for young prodigies. The preparations for the live appearance brought a mix of anxiety and excitement to the family. Lucas, carefree like any child, was eager to showcase his talents while David and Clara worried about the spotlight. Yet it was Clara who felt the most anxious about being scrutinized again by an audience that had already judged her harshly. In the studio before the show began, Clara could barely breathe from her nerves. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the journalists, the camera flashes, and the whispers in the distance. She knew what they thought, what the gossip headlines always implied, and it gnawed at her inside. David, always observant, sensed his wife's discomfort and held her hand tightly. "We're in this together, Clara, no matter what they say or what happens. They don't understand what we've endured," he said, his gaze locked on hers, trying to impart the strength she needed. Clara nodded slightly, but the feeling that something was about to unfold kept her restless. The memories of days spent on the streets and how society treated her remained vivid, an unhealed scar that would never fade. As Lucas stood at the center of the stage, the host began to introduce the boy as the prodigy who was taking the world by storm. The initial questions were directed at Lucas, who responded with his usual intelligence and charming innocence. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until the host subtly shifted his attention to Clara. "Clara, many are familiar with Lucas's remarkable journey, but I believe the audience would love to learn more about you. Did you always know he would be a genius?" Clara froze for a moment. The question seemed innocent, but she recognized it as a trap. She felt the weight of the cameras, the curious gazes from the audience, and the underlying judgment that always lingered over her. "Lucas has always been special," she began, trying to maintain her composure. "But we never imagined he would possess such talent. He surprises us every day." The host smiled, but appeared dissatisfied with her answer. "And what about you, Clara? Your story is equally intriguing. I know you didn't have an easy life before meeting David. Could you share a bit more about your journey to this point?" David, sitting beside her, gripped her hand tighter, knowing how much that question hurt her. He glanced briefly at the host, realizing he was trying to provoke a reaction. Clara felt her heart race. She had always known this moment would come, yet she wasn't prepared. How could she explain her past without being seen again as a woman who came from nothing? The fear of ridicule, that people might view her story as merely a shame to exploit, made her tremble. She glanced at Lucas, who was playing with blocks on stage, and knew that now, more than ever, she had to confront this moment. "It's true," Clara said, her voice wavering at first. "Before meeting David, my life was incredibly hard. I faced situations that many people can't even fathom. I lost my family, my friends, and ended up on the streets. Those were very difficult years." The studio fell silent, and all eyes were on her. Clara looked down, feeling the weight of the shame that had always accompanied her, yet she chose to continue. "I used to think there was no way out, that my life would always be the same. I saw no future, no hope. People looked at me as if I were invisible, as if I had no worth," Clara said, her voice starting to grow stronger. "But one day, David came into my life, and he saw me in a way that no one else had." She looked at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. "He didn't see me as a homeless woman. He saw me as a person, and that changed everything." The host, sensing the emotion in the air, tried to lighten the tone. "Clara, your story is truly inspiring. You rose from such a difficult situation to raise a brilliant boy. That's something we should all admire." Clara nodded, but inside, she knew there was more to say. She didn't want her story to be viewed merely as a tale of triumph, for she understood that the reality, it was a more complex era. But in that moment she also felt that she was finally shedding a weight she had carried for far too long. The shame that had haunted her for years since her days on the streets was now laid bare to the world, and although she still feared judgment, something inside her shifted. The program continued with questions about Lucas and his brilliant mind, but Clara was lost in her thoughts. When everything concluded and the cameras were turned off, she felt a deep sense of relief. David approached her and wrapped her in an embrace. "You were amazing," he said proudly. "There's nothing left to hide. We're in this together." Clara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you for never giving up on me." "I'll never give up," David replied, kissing her forehead. "Not on you or Lucas." As they left the studio, Lucas ran ahead, oblivious to what had just transpired. For the first time, Clara felt she could truly begin to live without the shadows of her past haunting her. She was no longer the woman whom people ignored on the streets. Now she was the mother of a genius, and the wife of a man who loved her unconditionally, regardless of her history. Above all, Clara was someone who, after years of suffering and struggle, had finally found peace within herself. Her revelation on the program sparked a wave of reactions she hadn't anticipated. The press, which had previously viewed her as a mystery to unravel, now regarded her with a fresh perspective. Some outlets attempted to portray her story as an inspiring tale of resilience, while others continued to emphasize her past to keep the scandal alive. However, what truly surprised Clara was the support she received from ordinary people, many of whom identified with her journey of struggle and survival. David, as always, stood by her side, sheltered by his characteristic composure in the face of criticism. But now, instead of defending himself, he felt that the weight was finally leveling out. Clara, his wife, was no longer the invisible woman the world mocked. She was someone who had faced more adversity than most could endure. Together with Lucas, they formed a family that didn't need validation from anyone. Still, the past that Clara had unveiled brought new complications. As days passed following the program, the behavior of those around David began to shift. Previously, they had laughed at him and his choices, but now they regarded him with respect, as someone who made a decision that few would have the courage to make. Yet it wasn't public acceptance that troubled Clara. What weighed heavily on her was the pressure this now placed on Lucas. He was still a child, becoming the center of attention not just for his talent but also for what he represented. The son of a woman who had come from the streets, the expectations placed on him were immense. On a calm morning, Clara sat in the garden of their home, watching Lucas play with his blocks. David moved closer, sitting beside her, feeling the tension in the air. "Is he okay?" David asked, his gaze fixed on their son. Clara nodded, yet concern etched her features. "He seems fine, but I don't know. He's just a child. All this weight, everything happening around him. I fear he might sense it sooner or later." David watched Lucas, who appeared oblivious to his surroundings, completely engrossed in his imaginative play. "He's tougher than you think, and we're here to shield him," David reassured, gripping Clara's hand. "We won't let any of this harm him." However, Clara knew that circumstances were beyond her control. Lucas was no longer merely David's son. He was seen as a prodigy, a genius bearing the hopes of many, and that frightened her. She dreaded that the world, in its eagerness for novelty, would consume him. A few weeks later, they were invited to a grand ceremony where Lucas was to receive an international award for young talents. Clara felt anxious. Events like these reminded her of how out of place she often felt. But Lucas, with his innocence and intellect, appeared thrilled at the thought of stepping onto the stage. On the night of the event, David donned his finest suit, while Clara, dressed simply, tried to feel at ease amidst the elite crowd. When Lucas's name was announced, The entire hall erupted in applause. He strode confidently to the stage, a shy smile on his face, and upon receiving the trophy, he gazed at the audience, the anticipation palpable. Everyone awaited a brilliant speech that matched his genius. Yet when he grasped the microphone, Lucas did something unexpected. Instead of discussing his talent or the award, he turned towards Clara and David, stating in a clear, steady voice, "I'm who I am because of my mom and dad. I'm not just a genius, I'm a child like any other, and they love me. Not for what I do, but for who I am." The audience fell silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words. David and Clara exchanged emotional glances. Lucas continued, "Everything I've achieved so far is due to their support, and that's what matters most to me." The crowd, previously enchanted by Lucas's talent, now recognized him as a child who, despite his brilliance, still needed a family to guide him. The applause was long and heartfelt, but Clara hardly heard it. Her heart brimmed with pride and relief. Lucas had voiced what she feared he might never have the opportunity to say, that above all he was merely a child and not a trophy for the world to display. After the ceremony, as the lights dimmed and people began to leave, Clara, David, and Lucas slipped out through the back of the theater, away from the camera flashes. They were exhausted but relieved. When they reached the car, Lucas, already half asleep, nestled in Clara's lap. She gently stroked his hair, feeling tranquility finally settle in her soul as David headed back. As David drove home, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the two of them and couldn't help but smile. He understood that their journey would still be fraught with challenges, but for the first time, he felt they had weathered a storm and emerged stronger on the other side. As the car moved along the deserted road, Clara gazed at the horizon, sensing that despite everything, they had discovered something invaluable. The cost of true love was never easy, nor would it ever be. But in the end, it was the only price worth paying. David took her hand once more, and in that moment, everything felt serene. There were no more secrets, no more fears, just the love that bound them together, even as the world seemed to crumble around them.